Good morning. It's lovely to be with you guys this morning. My dad used to tell me that if I was going to do anything, that I should do it with 100% commitment. If I was going to do something, put my mind to it, commit to it fully, and follow it through. And for a while, and still is, this is very good advice. And generally, having always good intentions as a child, it meant that when I did put my mind to things, I would work hard and I would see it through to the finish. The idea was that I would become a responsible and reliable adult. And I took the commitments that I had very seriously. And that was the idea. So with hobbies and small responsibilities when I was younger, it worked like this very well. But actually, as I grew a bit older, there's some times where this doesn't quite work. And I was reminiscing a little bit with Will and with Lucy earlier this week about times where I used to be in a yearly dance show. And we would do these shows kind of every year, and lots of different dancers. And they were hard to learn, but I would be so committed to dancing the parts. And there was one dance where actually part of the dancing was rolling around on the floor, and we'd kind of get up and then we'd roll around again, which was hard to do anyway. And I suppose someone a little bit more petite and a bit elegant than I might have done it with a bit more grace, but I was already a little bit heavy at the time anyway, so heavy footing, rolling was the way I did it. But there was this one time, and it was the Saturday night show, arguably the most popular of the shows, and it was the time that Will and Lucy and a couple of my friends had come to see me in this show. And I just rolled too early, and I was on the floor, and I suppose my dad's advice came into my head. I kind of thought, right, I can either just get up straight away and fudge it and pretend it never happened, or I could just commit. I could just do what my dad had always told me to do and just go for it. And it was a very long 30 seconds of waiting on the floor. All the other dancers, the 11 other dancers, were gliding and hopping up on the dance floor, and I looked like I'd had a nap and just laid staring at the ceiling, waiting for the others to join me. And at least I had the commitment to follow it through. That's all I'm going to say. My dad he couldn't blame me for my commitment to the part. And there are some things that certainly need a bit of a grey area. There are some things where this advice isn't the best sort of advice. But in the case of our reading from James today, it is the best sort of advice. Verse 4 says, "You adulterous people, don't you know that the friendship with the world means enmity with God? Therefore, anyone who chooses to be a friend of the world becomes an enemy of God." The reading talks about the difference between earthly good and desires and heavenly and spiritual ones. And the word desires in Greek translates literally into hedons, which is a literal measure of happiness. And in this case, the worldly desires James is critiquing is causing disputes and quarrels. And it's not the right and the wrong of the case that James is annoyed at. It's the motive behind the fights. It's the selfishness, the jealousy, and the rivalry. All of these things are worldly and come from looking at the world and how we can benefit ourselves without considering any of the heavenly impacts. And when we go into relationship with God, we learn to look at things through a spiritual perspective. And we leave the worldly one behind. We choose to leave it behind. And James is basically urging people in this verse to step it up a gear. He says that by doing these things, by thinking too worldly in this way, that we are adulterous people, and in essence, cheating on God. It's really strong language. We have made a commitment as God's people to live and think a certain way. And by giving in to selfish motivations, to jealous thoughts, we are flirting with the enemy. To James, there is no grey area. It is all or nothing in these verses. And the adultery part of these verses is the key to understanding. We have tied ourselves to God, and so flirting with the world isn't an option. A total, unreserved, unwavering allegiance to God is required, and to reject the attitudes and the values of the world. And to clarify, this isn't talking about purely interacting with people that aren't Christians. It's not talking about shutting ourselves away and being our own little Christian bubble and not interacting with the world at all. But it's talking about how to live in the world and not of the world. Being part of the day-to-day worldly life, but not following the values that control it. I wonder what sort of thing that you have thought about when I've talked about living of the world. In Matthew, it talks directly about not being controlled by money. And certainly this is a big part of what drives our society today. And maybe money and finance is something that you feel a particular difficulty with. But James doesn't actually specify one particular thing, and I think it's because there are things that control us that are a bit broader than that. Popularity, achievement, status, all common idols and desires, motivations of the world, and all of these things become easy to idolize, and it's easy for it to become what drives us. We can get so fixated on fitting in or achieving a certain thing or being the best that we get lost in that motivation and we lose God by becoming a slave to something else. But whatever it is that we might be slaves to, it says in Matthew, you cannot have two masters. You can't be in the middle of it. You can't be in the grey area. You can't be flirting with both but never committed to either. The whole of James is pretty challenging, and as we've seen, but this in particular is pretty brutal. What I've said so far is pretty hardcore. He is not holding back on telling us exactly how it is and how it should be, and exactly how we're going wrong, and what needs to happen to get it right. And so it's impossible to feel a little bit daunted by this. I'm saying these words and going, oh gosh, I'm not perfect myself. It isn't easy to live a spiritual life immersed in often a non-spiritual world. And so how are we meant to keep up with this? And if we don't, it looks like James is saying that we're going to be an enemy of God. They're scary passages. But right next to it, verse 6 says, he gives us more grace. The truth is that God doesn't set boundaries for us that are impossible to reach. He forgives, and he will always forgive us when we come to him with a sincere heart. And I think the reason for this strong language is because maybe people that he was speaking to, but certainly I felt myself, that you can take advantage of God's forgiving nature. He's trying to get rid of the idea that just because God does forgive, it means that we can take full advantage and keep living for worldly things, and God will forgive us, and that's going to be fine. God gives grace, but James is basically saying, but don't test it. So what is it that James actually tells us to do? What can we do to help this? And one of the weird things he says in the next few verses is to grieve, mourn, and wail. And again, I'm reading this passage and thinking, this is really sad. This is really stressful. To change your laughter into mourning and your joy to gloom, it's not massively encouraging. And I was assured to read more into it that it isn't James trying to be a killjoy. He isn't talking generally. He's actually talking about your attitude to sinning. I'm in a childcare bubble with the Stevensons, and I didn't actually check that this was okay to share, but it's going to be fine. And Ethan will occasionally do something, Ethan, who's 8, will occasionally do something to annoy his siblings, and rather than sincerely apologize, he will sing, and I think it's my favorite way to apologize ever, I'm teleporting you to the land of sorry. And it is so insincere, it's so brilliant, because he's not sorry at all, and he's just trying to he's just found this song that tries to make it okay. I'm going to do it again. I'm teleporting you to the land of sorry. It is amazing. It is probably the most hilarious way of saying sorry, but no, he doesn't often mean it. And of course, Ethan is 8, so we're okay with it so far, and he is learning the way to say sorry sincerely. But James is saying, actually, if you are actively doing things wrong and laughing it off, nothing, serious about it, and asking forgiveness insincerely, then you might as well not do it. To clarify, I'm not judging Ethan, he is 8. If you've got the wrong motivation, or simply just going through the motions of confessions and asking for forgiveness, but not actually meaning that you're going to change, then it's just as bad as not at all. But the main thing James says is to submit yourselves then to God. Submission is not seen as a positive thing at the moment. Our culture, our world, is all about independence and building yourself tall and never needing anyone else. And submission is seen as a sign of weakness. Many of us will have had points in our lives where we've been told to be stronger, to suck it up or to get a grip, and to appear like we have it all together. But submission means caving in, admitting you can't do it on your own, admitting you get it wrong sometimes, and admitting actually that you need a bit of help. Submission is incredibly countercultural and maybe one of the biggest differences between our culture and following God, because relationship with God means submission. But the difference is that the outcome of this vulnerability, the outcome of the weakness towards God, means something different to how it is in our world. God promises more to us when we do this. When we have submitted ourselves to him, to say we know he is greater and that he knows better, when we're in this ultimate weakness and vulnerably bringing ourselves to him, there's no judgment. There's no mocking. God, full of grace, transforms us. He forgives us. When we are all in with God, when we decide to go 100%, God actually gives us life back. And we have to put down what might seem so big in this world, but we get something back that blows it out of the water, and suddenly our perspective can change completely. There's a song lyric from a worship song that I love that sums this up, and I'm going to leave you with it today. It says, "I touched the sky when my knees hit the ground. I found my life when I laid it down." Because when we submit to him, we are raised to life. When we go all in with God, when we fully commit 100%, we get even more back. Amen.